Get your filthy hands off my seat! Douglas Hirst hissed his alcohol-laced breath, cutting through the recycled air of Flight 1387. 8-year-old Layla Williams froze, her small hand hovering inches from the armrest she'd accidentally touched. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. No one could have predicted how quickly the situation would escalate, or that the quiet man in seat 14C would transform from an ordinary passenger into the federal agent whose intervention would spark a nationwide movement. "Sir, I'm sorry," Layla whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched her stuffed giraffe tighter against her chest. The fear in her eyes reflected the overhead lights as she pressed closer to her mother. Douglas Pierce, a 55-year-old executive whose Brooks Brothers suit couldn't disguise the meanness in his eyes, sneered down at her. "Just keep your hands and everything else to yourself." Tiana Williams put a protective arm around her daughter, her expression a careful mask of composure, despite the anger building beneath. She barely touched the armrest. "There's no need to speak to her that way." The Chicago to Atlanta flight had only been in the air for 20 minutes. For most passengers, it was just another routine journey. For Layla Williams, it would become the terrifying moment that would haunt her dreams. For Dominic Reynolds, the Air Marshal silently observing from 3 rows back, it would be the day he could no longer remain invisible. As the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, passengers tightened their seatbelts. Dominic's trained eye registered Pierce's white-knuckled grip on his third scotch, the tight line of his jaw, the way his gaze fixated with irrational intensity on the little girl. 15 years of experience recognized the warning signs of trouble brewing at 30,000 feet. Pierce's next words sliced through the cabin's ambient noise. "People need to control their children." The pointed emphasis on people carried unmistakable weight. Dominic shifted imperceptibly in his seat. His job was to remain undetected, to blend in with other passengers unless a threat required intervention. But something in the man's tone, in the calculated cruelty directed at a child, made his training war with his conscience. What no one on that flight realized was how the next few minutes would not only change the lives of everyone involved, but would expose a pattern of unchecked discrimination that had festered across the airline industry for decades. What started as a confrontation in row 8 would ultimately ground planes, launch congressional hearings, and force a reckoning that would reverberate through corporate boardrooms and family discussions across America. The storm that was building would break over all their heads before they reached Atlanta. At 4:30 a.m., Dominic Reynolds' alarm cut through the darkness of his Chicago apartment. His hand silenced it with practiced efficiency before it could complete its first cycle. 15 years as an air marshal had conditioned his body to wake instantly, mind clear and ready. The pre-dawn routine never varied: 20 minutes of calisthenics, a quick shower, black coffee drunk while reviewing his flight assignment. Today, United 1387, Chicago O'Hare to Atlanta, Hartsfield, Jackson. Departure. A routine domestic flight, the kind he'd worked hundreds of times before. As he knotted his tie, conservative, forgettable, exactly what the Federal Air Marshal Service manual recommended, his eyes drifted to the photo on his dresser. Olivia at 12, her smile bright despite the circumstances. The picture had been taken 2 days after the incident at her school, when she'd insisted on returning, despite the racial taunts that had left her in tears the week before. "They win if I hide, Dad," she'd said, her resilience both inspired and haunted him. 3 months had passed since that day, but the memory remained raw. The school administration's tepid response still burned how they'd called it, an unfortunate misunderstanding, rather than what it was, blatant bullying motivated by the color of his daughter's skin. His phone chimed with a text from his sister Janelle. "Olivia's doing great with me. Don't worry, focus on your work. Love you both." Dominic texted back his thanks. This rotation's schedule had been particularly challenging for single parenting, and he was grateful for his sister's help with Olivia while he completed this week's flights. The taxi ride to O'Hare gave him time to mentally prepare transitioning into the hyper-observant state his job required. His training had taught him to become practically invisible, the forgettable passenger no one would remember afterward. Not too friendly, not too aloof, the perfect anonymity required for surveillance. At the airport, he followed protocol, arriving 2 hours before the flight. His credentials gave him expedited clearance through security, though he still observed the other passengers, a habit impossible to break. His trained eye catalogued behaviors, expressions, anything out of pattern, while his conscious mind barely registered the activity. During his pre-flight briefing with the Chicago field office supervisor, they discussed standard threat assessments. Nothing flagged for this flight. Just another day watching people sleep and eat pretzels, his supervisor joked. Dominic smiled politely, but something felt off today. A tension he couldn't name. "Everything okay?" Reynolds, the supervisor, asked. "All good," Dominic replied automatically. "Just didn't sleep well." But as he headed toward his gate, the truth settled in his chest. Since Olivia's bullying incident, something had shifted in his worldview. The invisible barriers and prejudices he'd navigated his entire life had suddenly become more apparent, more painful when they affected his daughter. He'd spent his career being the invisible protector, the one who blended into the background until danger emerged. But lately he'd been questioning whether remaining invisible in the face of everyday injustice was really protecting anyone at all. "Mum, look. That plane has a face." Layla Williams pointed excitedly at the nose of a Boeing 737, its cockpit windows and air intake creating an accidental pareidolia that delighted her 8-year-old imagination. Tiana Williams smiled, adjusting her daughter's purple backpack. "It does look like it's smiling, doesn't it?" Michael Williams checked their boarding passes again, a habit from years of business travel. "Gate B14, right on time. We've got about 40 minutes before boarding." The family moved through O'Hare's bustling Terminal 1, Layla skipping occasionally between her parents. This trip to Atlanta was special. Her grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary celebration awaited them, complete with cousins Layla rarely got to see. Will Grandma have made her famous peach cobbler? Layla asked, her mind already racing ahead to the weekend's festivities. "You know she will," Michael assured her, resting his hand briefly on his daughter's shoulder. "Probably made 2 just for you." At the gate, Michael found 3 seats together in the waiting area. Tiana pulled out a book from her carry-on, the historical novel she'd been saving for the flight, while Michael responded to a few work emails. Layla opened her sketchbook-colored pencils arranged precisely beside her as she began drawing what appeared to be a family portrait. "Is that all of us at Grandma and Grandpa's house?" Tiana asked, peering over at the drawing. Layla nodded, her braids bobbing with the movement. "And look, I'm making Grandma's cobbler with her in the kitchen." A harried gate agent approached, her expression tight with professional courtesy stretched thin. "Excuse me, are you the Williams family? We have a slight seat assignment issue." Michael frowned. "We booked 3 seats together months ago." The agent, whose name tag read Patricia, tapped rapidly on her tablet. "Yes, I see that. Unfortunately, there was an equipment change. We're trying to accommodate everyone, but we may need to separate." "We have an 8-year-old child," Tiana interrupted firmly. "She needs to sit with at least one parent." Patricia's eyes flicked to Layla, then back to her tablet. "Of course. Let me see what I can do." Her fingers worked quickly, her expression clearing slightly. "Actually, I can keep you in the same row. The window and middle in row 8 and the aisle seat across in 8C. Michael nodded. "That will work. Thank you." As Patricia walked away, Tiana whispered, "Did you notice how surprised she seemed when she actually looked at us?" Michael's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I noticed. It was a familiar experience, the subtle recalibration that happened when people who had only heard their names suddenly saw their faces." The Williams family had learned to navigate these moments with practiced dignity especially in front of Layla. "Dad, can I have the window seat?" Layla asked, oblivious to the subtext of the exchange. Of course, Sparrow Michael said, using his pet name for her. "You're the official cloud counter on this journey." Layla beamed and returned to her drawing, adding more details to her grandfather's face. Her world for now remained full of peach cobblers, family celebrations, and the excitement of seeing clouds from above. Neither Michael nor Tiana could have known that their careful protection of their daughter's innocence would be shattered before they even reached Atlanta. Douglas Pierce slammed his empty tumbler on the polished bar of the United Club lounge. Another he demanded, not bothering to look at the bartender. The young man behind the bar hesitated. "Sir, that would be your third double scotch, and boarding for Atlanta begins in 20 minutes. Pierce fixed the bartender with a cold stare. "Did I ask for your opinion?" "Another, now." As the bartender reluctantly poured, Pierce returned to glowering at his phone. The email from the board was still there, each word like a personal affront. "Decided to pursue other candidates for the CEO position. Your contributions have been valued. Wish you continued success." After 15 years as CFO, he'd been passed over. The board had chosen Victoria Abernathy instead, younger with less experience, but apparently with the fresh perspective the company needed. The fact that she was a woman hadn't been mentioned explicitly, but Pierce knew what this was: diversity optics trumping merit and loyalty. His phone rang. Martin Blackwell, his brother-in-law. Pierce answered with a grunt. "Doug calling to check in. Karen told me about the board's decision." "Tough break." Pierce took a long swallow of his fresh drink. "Tough break. It's a damn travesty. 15 years making that company profitable, and they reward me by giving the top job to a diversity hire." "Keep your voice down," Martin warned. "Look, I know you're upset, but upset doesn't begin to cover it. The world's gone mad, Martin. Everyone's so concerned with appearances and political correctness that actual qualifications mean nothing anymore." The ice clinked in his glass as he finished the scotch in one burning gulp. "You're still landing on your feet," Martin reminded him. "The severance package is generous, and with your track record." "That's not the point." Pierce's voice rose, drawing glances from nearby travelers. "It's the principle. It's—" He stopped, noticing the attention. "Never mind, I've got to board soon anyway. You sound like you've been drinking." Martin observed. "Is that wise before a flight?" "Don't start." "I'm fine." Pierce ended the call abruptly and signaled for his check. As he gathered his briefcase and carry-on, the alcohol buzzed pleasantly through his system, dulling the edges of his humiliation, but sharpening his resentment. By the time he reached gate B14, the first-class passengers were already lining up. Pierce shouldered his way to the front, ignoring the quiet murmurs of those already queued. When the gate agent asked for his boarding pass, he practically threw it at her. "Seat 8D aisle," she said pleasantly, seemingly impervious to his rudeness. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Pierce." He grunted in response, already focused on the jetway ahead. As he boarded, the flight attendant's welcoming smile received a similar dismissal. Pierce stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment with unnecessary force and dropped into his assigned seat, immediately closing his eyes to discourage conversation. The mixture of alcohol and anger pulsed behind his temples. All he wanted was a quiet flight where he could nurse his grievances in peace. The last thing Douglas Pierce needed today was any kind of disturbance. He was in no state to deal with people, especially the kind of people he already blamed for the derailment of his carefully plotted career trajectory. Dominic Reynolds boarded midway through the process, timing his entrance to blend with the wave of Zone 3 passengers. He scanned each face automatically, mentally flagging and dismissing potential concerns with practiced efficiency. The young man with the nervous tic, just afraid of flying. The woman clutching her bag too tightly. Separation anxiety from checked luggage. Nothing more. The businessman in 8D radiating hostility. Likely personal problems, alcohol evident, but not an immediate security threat. Dominic stowed his single carry-on and took his seat in 14C, positioned to observe most of the cabin, while appearing to be just another business traveler. He pulled out a trade magazine, dull enough to be forgettable, substantive enough to look occupied, and began his surveillance routine behind the shield of its pages. 3 rows ahead, the Williams family was settling into their seats. Layla bounced excitedly by the window, her face pressed against the plexiglass. "Remember indoor voice on the plane," Michael reminded her gently as he helped her with the seatbelt. "I know," Daddy Layla whispered dramatically, making her father smile. Tiana took the middle seat beside her daughter while Michael prepared to sit across the aisle. As he approached 8C, he noticed the man already in 8D. Douglas Pierce had sprawled into his personal space, his arm commandeering the shared armrest, his legs angled to encroach on 8C's foot area. "Excuse me," Michael said politely. "I believe this is my seat." Pierce barely opened his eyes, making a minimal shift that did little to actually make space. Michael squeezed past, accidentally brushing against Pierce's knees in the process. "Watch it," Pierce muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Michael chose not to engage, settling into his seat with deliberate calm. Across the aisle, Layla was showing Tiana something in her activity book, blissfully unaware of the tension. Flight attendant Carmen Vasquez moved efficiently through the cabin, helping passengers with luggage and addressing pre-flight questions. At 34, with 12 years of experience, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense potential issues before they escalated. As she passed row 8, something in the dynamic caught her attention. The body language of the man in 8D radiated hostility, while the family seemed to be making themselves as small as possible to avoid disturbing him. She'd seen this pattern before and made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. "Can I get you anything before takeoff, sir?" Carmen asked Pierce, her professional smile firmly in place. "Scotch neat," he replied without looking up. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't serve alcohol until we're at cruising altitude. I'd be happy to bring that to you once we're in the air." Pierce finally turned to look at her, his expression sour. "Fine. Whatever." Carmen nodded and continued down the aisle. As she passed Dominic's row, their eyes met briefly, the silent communication of 2 professionals recognizing each other without acknowledgement. Her subtle head tilt toward row 8 was almost imperceptible. "Message received, potential trouble spot noted." Back in row 8, Layla's excitement couldn't be contained completely. "Mom, look at all the luggage cars. They look like little ants from up here." Her voice, though not excessively loud, seemed to grate on Pierce. He shifted in his seat, sighing heavily to communicate his annoyance. Tiana gently shushed her daughter. "Remember what Dad said about indoor voices, Ori?" Layla whispered, but her enthusiasm remained undimmed. She turned her attention to arranging her treasures for the flight. Her sketchbook, colored pencils, and beloved stuffed giraffe named Spots. As she adjusted her tray table, her small elbow accidentally brushed the back of Pierce's seat. It was the lightest of touches, barely perceptible. Pierce turned, fixing Layla with a cold stare. "Keep your hands to yourself." The harshness in his voice made Layla shrink back against her seat, clutching Spots closer. Tiana straightened, maternal protection flaring. "It was an accident," she said evenly. "She's just getting settled." Pierce maintained eye contact a beat too long before turning away with another dramatic sigh. From his vantage point, Dominic observed the interaction with growing concern. The man's reaction was disproportionate, his hostility palpable. While not yet a security threat, the situation contained the volatile elements that could escalate quickly in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. As the plane pushed back from the gate and the safety demonstration began, Dominic kept his attention divided between his magazine and row 8, where the invisible lines of tension were already being drawn. The engines roared as Flight 1387 accelerated down the runway, pressing passengers back into their seats. For Layla, this moment was pure magic. The thrilling sensation of being pushed by invisible hands, the ground falling away as buildings and cars transformed into miniature versions of themselves. "We're flying, Mom," she whispered excitedly, mindful of keeping her voice down after the man's harsh words. Tiana smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "We sure are, sweetheart." Across the aisle, Michael maintained his composed demeanor, though his attention remained split between his family and the increasingly agitated man beside him. Douglas Pierce's breaths came in sharp bursts through his nose, his hands gripping the armrests as the plane climbed. His face flushed, with what could be mistaken for fear of flying, but Michael suspected was simmering anger fueled by alcohol. From seat 14C, Dominic Reynolds maintained his practiced surveillance. His attention moved methodically through the cabin, noting behaviors, tracking movements, assessing potential concerns. Most passengers were engaged in typical post-takeoff routines, adjusting headphones, opening books, preparing tablets for entertainment. Normal, predictable behaviors. But row 8 continued to draw his attention. The little girl by the window was behaving like any excited child her age, pointing out clouds and whispering to her mother. The father sat rigidly across the aisle, his body language revealing hyper-awareness of the man next to him. And that man, Dominic, had encountered his type before. The set of his shoulders, the controlled yet visible anger, the entitled expectation that the world should conform to his comfort. All warning signs that Dominic had learned never to ignore. Carmen Vasquez moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency as the plane leveled off. She had already categorized most passengers, the anxious flyers who needed reassurance, the frequent travelers who wanted minimal interaction, the families requiring extra assistance. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. You are now free to move about the cabin," she announced. "We'll be starting our beverage service shortly." When she reached row 8, Carmen paused. "What can I get you to drink, sir?" she asked Pierce first, hoping to address his earlier request promptly and potentially diffuse his evident irritation. "Scotch. Double." "No ice," Pierce replied curtly. She nodded and turned to Michael. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, thank you." Michael responded with a politeness that stood in stark contrast to his row mate. And for the ladies across the aisle, Carmen smiled warmly at Tiana and Layla. "Apple juice, please?" Layla replied, her enthusiasm making Carmen's smile genuine. "Water for me as well," Tiana added. As Carmen continued down the aisle, she caught Dominic's eye again. A subtle nod confirmed their shared assessment of row 8. She would serve Pierce's drink quickly, but monitor his consumption carefully. Passengers who combined alcohol with apparent pre-existing anger were a common source of in-flight incidents. When the beverage cart reached Dominic's row, he requested a ginger ale, maintaining his unremarkable presence. Carmen placed a full can and a plastic cup on his tray, with professional courtesy, their interaction deliberately forgettable. 10 minutes later, Pierce had already finished his first scotch and was signaling for another. Carmen approached with measured steps. "Another scotch, sir." Obviously, Pierce muttered, handing her the empty cup. As Carmen served his second drink, she quietly noted the time in her mental log. 2 doubles in less than 20 minutes was approaching the threshold where airline policy recommended caution. Meanwhile, Layla was carefully sipping her apple juice, her small hands cradling the cup with exaggerated care to avoid spills. She had opened her activity book across her tray table, colored pencils arranged in rainbow order beside it. "Mom, can I draw Grandma and Grandpa's anniversary cake?" she asked. "That's a lovely idea," Tiana responded, keeping her voice low. As Layla selected a purple pencil, it rolled slightly on the tray. She caught it before it could fall, but the movement caused her to jostle her juice cup. Nothing spilled, but the small sound of plastic against plastic seemed to irritate Pierce further. He glared across the aisle, then turned to Michael. "Can't you control your kid?" he muttered, low enough that Layla couldn't hear, but loud enough for Michael to catch every word. Michael maintained his composure. "She's doing fine," he replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. Pierce snorted and returned to his drink, muttering something under his breath that made Michael's jaw tighten imperceptibly. From his position, Dominic observed the exchange, noting the increasing tension. The conflict remained verbal and relatively contained, but experience told him such situations rarely de-escalated on their own in the confined environment of an aircraft cabin. He shifted slightly in his seat, maintaining his relaxed appearance, while positioning himself for quicker access to the aisle if needed. The plane continued eastward, carrying its passengers through clear skies toward Atlanta, but inside the cabin, storm clouds were gathering. 30 minutes into the flight, the first serious pocket of turbulence hit without warning. The plane dropped suddenly, then shuddered as it passed through unstable air. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but authoritative. "Folks, we're hitting a bit of rough air. I'm turning the seatbelt sign back on. Please return to your seats and remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The timing couldn't have been worse. Layla had just picked up her apple juice for another sip when the plane lurched. Despite her careful grip, physics won out. The cup tipped, sending a stream of amber liquid across her tray table over the edge and directly onto the sleeve of Douglas Pierce's light grey suit jacket. Pierce recoiled as if struck. "What the—" He cut himself off from completing the expletive, but his face contorted with rage as he stared at the spreading stain on his sleeve. "I'm sorry." Layla's voice trembled with genuine distress. "I didn't mean to—" Tiana immediately reached for the cocktail napkins that had come with their drinks, offering them across the aisle. It was the turbulence, she explained, her voice calm but urgent. "Let us help you clean that up." Pierce ignored the offered napkins instead, fixing Layla with an icy stare. "Jesus Christ," he hissed, his voice cutting through the ambient cabin noise. "This is $1,000 suit. Can't you people teach your kids some basic manners?" The phrase "you people" hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. Michael unbuckled his seatbelt, half rising despite the illuminated sign. "It was an accident caused by turbulence," he said firmly. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd watch how you speak to my daughter. Sir, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened," Carmen called from her jump seat at the front of the cabin, spotting the confrontation immediately. Michael slowly sat back down, but his eyes remained locked with Pierce's. "Accident or not, control your kid better," Pierce muttered loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. He angrily dabbed at his sleeve with his own napkin, making a show of his inconvenience. Layla's eyes had welled with tears. "I said I was sorry," she whispered. The surrounding passengers' reactions varied. A few averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the tension. Others watched openly, some with sympathy for the family, others with disapproval aimed at Pierce. An older woman in row 9 leaned forward. "It was just turbulence, dear," she said gently to Layla. "Could have happened to anyone." Pierce turned his glare to the woman who met his gaze steadily before deliberately looking away. In seat 14C, Dominic Reynolds had straightened at the first sound of confrontation. His hand moved to his phone, ready to activate the discreet alert system that would notify the cockpit of a potential security concern. But he hesitated. The situation, while tense, hadn't yet crossed the threshold that required his professional intervention. His role as an air marshal was to address genuine threats to flight safety, not to police social interactions, no matter how unpleasant. Yet the man's disproportionate anger and the specific phrasing of "you people" had set off warning bells. This wasn't just about spilled juice. As if reading his thoughts, a woman in row 12, Jessica Monroe, though Dominic didn't know her name yet, discreetly positioned her phone. The camera lens peeking between seats. She'd recognized something concerning in the exchange, too enough to start documenting. The turbulence subsided, but the tension in row 8 continued to build. Pierce now shifted away from Michael as far as his seat allowed his body language, a study in disgust and anger. He signaled Carmen for another scotch. Carmen approached cautiously. "Sir, I notice you've had 2 drinks already and we've only been in the air for about 30 minutes. I'd be happy to bring you some water or coffee instead." Pierce's face darkened further. "I'm paying business class fares. If I want another scotch, I expect to receive one." Carmen maintained her professional demeanor. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right away." She caught Michael's eye briefly, her expression apologetic, before moving back toward the galley. Tiana had her arm around Layla, who was still fighting back tears, her excitement about the flight thoroughly dampened. The activity book lay forgotten as she clutched her stuffed giraffe, whispering something into its ear. "What is she saying to that toy?" Pierce demanded, suddenly staring at Layla. Tiana's expression hardened. "She's telling Spots that everything will be okay because accidents happen and most people understand that." Pierce snorted. "Passive-aggressive parenting." "Wonderful." Sir Michael said, his voice deliberately controlled. "I understand you're upset about your jacket, but it's just juice. It will wash out. There's no need to continue making my daughter feel worse about an accident she couldn't control." Whatever Pierce muttered, turning away again, but not before adding, "Some people shouldn't travel if they can't control their kids." The repeated emphasis on some people wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Dominic watched as the situation momentarily plateaued. No physical threat had materialized, but the undercurrent of hostility had taken on an unmistakably racial dimension. He noted Jessica Monroe was still recording discreetly, her instincts aligning with his own assessment that this situation might require documentation. The flight attendant returned with Pierce's 3rd scotch, placing it on his tray table with noticeably less warmth than before. "Here you are, sir. The captain expects we'll be experiencing more turbulence as we approach a weather system, so please be careful with your drink." Pierce barely acknowledged her, taking a large swallow as soon as she moved away. From row 10, a businessman who had been observing the situation leaned forward and spoke quietly to Michael. "Hey man, do you want to switch seats? I'm happy to sit next to that guy if it helps." Before Michael could respond, Pierce interjected loudly. "Don't bother. I'm sure he's very comfortable right where he is, making everyone else miserable." The offering passenger raised his eyebrows, but said nothing more, settling back in his seat. Dominic's concern deepened. The situation was escalating in a pattern he'd seen before: alcohol emboldening prejudice, perceived public humiliation, increasing hostility. From experience, he knew the next 40 minutes would be critical. Either the tension would dissipate, or it would build toward a breaking point. He just hoped that breaking point wouldn't involve an 8-year-old child who had done nothing wrong except exist in the same space as a man determined to make her feel unwelcome. The flight progressed in tense silence for the next 20 minutes. Dominic observed Pierce finish his 3rd scotch and signal for a 4th, which Carmen reluctantly provided after a moment's hesitation. Airline policy generally suggested limiting passengers to 3 alcoholic beverages, but enforcement was largely left to flight attendants' discretion. Carmen was clearly monitoring the situation while trying to avoid a confrontation that might exacerbate tensions. Layla had grown increasingly withdrawn, her earlier excitement replaced by anxious vigilance. She spoke in whispers to her mother, kept her limbs tucked close, and cast occasional nervous glances toward Pierce. The natural exuberance of childhood had been effectively suppressed by a grown man's hostility. Michael maintained his composed exterior, but Dominic noted the telltale signs of a father struggling to contain his protective instincts, the tightness around his eyes, the controlled breathing, the way his attention remained split between his family and the volatile man beside him. In row 12, Jessica Monroe continued her discreet documentation. As a marketing executive who had experienced her share of workplace discrimination, she recognized the subtext of Pierce's behavior. What had started as irritation over a spilled drink had revealed something uglier beneath the surface. Pierce's behavior had shifted slightly with each drink. His initial contained anger had given way to a looser, more vocal expression of his resentment. He began muttering audibly comments clearly intended to be overheard. Standards have really gone downhill, letting anyone fly business class these days, probably using welfare points. A few nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. An older gentleman across the aisle from Jessica shook his head disapprovingly. Carmen passed through the cabin again, checking on passengers. When she reached row 8, she addressed the Williams family first. "Can I get you anything else? Perhaps some pretzels or cookies for your daughter?" Tiana smiled gratefully. "Some cookies would be nice, thank you." Pierce interrupted before Carmen could respond. "Oh, sure, give them special treatment now." Customer service by guilt. Carmen turned to him, her professional smile firmly in place, though considerably cooler. "Sir, I'm offering the same snacks to all passengers. Would you like some as well?" "I want another scotch," he demanded, holding up his nearly empty cup. Carmen hesitated. "Sir, you've had 4 drinks in less than an hour. I'd be happy to bring you water juice or soda instead." Pierce's face flushed darker. "Are you cutting me off? Is that what's happening here?" "I'm suggesting a non-alcoholic alternative for your comfort and safety," Carmen replied evenly. "This is ridiculous," Pierce said loudly. "I'm a paying customer being denied service because what she complained." He jerked his head toward Tiana. "No one has complained about service, sir," Carmen said. "I'm simply following standard beverage service guidelines." "Right," Pierce scoffed. "I'm sure you enforce those guidelines equally for everyone." The air quotes he made around guidelines were exaggerated and mocking. Carmen maintained her composure. "I'll bring cookies for everyone in this row," she said, then moved on before the situation could escalate further. Pierce turned toward Michael. "Your wife put her up to that, didn't she?" Michael met his gaze steadily. "No one is conspiring against you, sir. The flight attendant is just doing her job." "Like hell she is," Pierce muttered, but didn't pursue the conversation further. Jessica Monroe adjusted her phone slightly, ensuring she was still capturing the interaction. She caught the eye of the man seated next to her, a professor from Northwestern University named Robert Daniels, who nodded slightly in tacit approval of her documentation. "He's been inappropriate from the start," she whispered. "Completely." Robert agreed quietly. That poor family. From his vantage point, Dominic noted the small alliance forming among concerned passengers. This was typically a positive development. Community reinforcement of appropriate boundaries could sometimes de-escalate situations without requiring official intervention. But Pierce seemed beyond caring about social disapproval. His behavior indicated a man who felt justified in his actions, perhaps even victimized himself. The alcohol had stripped away his inhibitions, revealing what Dominic suspected were his true feelings. Feelings normally kept hidden behind a veneer of civility. Carmen returned with cookies for row 8, distributing them efficiently before moving on. Layla accepted hers with a subdued thank you, her usual enthusiasm notably absent. As the little girl carefully opened the package, one of the cookies broke, and a small piece fell onto her tray. She picked it up quickly, but Pierce noticed the crumb and made an exaggerated sound of disgust. "Great, now there'll be crumbs everywhere. Just what I needed." Tiana spoke up, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Sir, we are doing our absolute best to accommodate your apparent need for a sterile environment, despite being on a commercial flight with over 100 people. My daughter is being more careful than many adults would be. I would appreciate it if you would stop making comments about her." Pierce turned to face her directly for the first time. "Listen, I paid good money for this seat, and I have a right to—" "So did we," Michael interjected firmly. "And my family has the right to exist in this space without constant criticism." Pierce's expression darkened. "Of course you'll make it about that. Always playing the victim card when someone calls out bad behavior." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable to everyone within earshot. 2 rows behind them, a middle-aged white woman audibly gasped at Pierce's comment. In row 11, a businessman who had been pretending to sleep opened his eyes, his attention now fully on the escalating situation. Dominic shifted in his seat, calculating. The conflict was approaching the threshold, where intervention might be necessary, not yet for security reasons, but for maintaining order in the cabin. Typically, this would be the flight attendant's responsibility. But he sensed Carmen was trying to avoid a confrontation that might make things worse. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we're about to hit some weather. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare for turbulence." Carmen and the other flight attendants quickly moved through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and tray tables secured. As she passed row 8, she noted the tension, but could do little more than ensure everyone was properly secured. The plane began to shake as it entered the predicted turbulence. Layla grabbed for her mother's hand, her fear of the angry man now compounded by the frightening movement of the aircraft. "It's okay, sweetie," Tiana reassured her. "Just a little bumpy air." As the turbulence increased, Dominic noted Pierce's white-knuckled grip on his armrests, his face now showing signs of genuine discomfort, or perhaps fear, beneath the anger. Sometimes Dominic knew fear manifested as aggression, a primitive response to perceived vulnerability. But understanding the psychology didn't make the man's behavior acceptable, especially when directed at a child. The plane dropped suddenly, eliciting gasps from several passengers. Layla let out a small cry of fear, quickly muffled against her mother's shoulder. Pierce turned toward the sound, his expression twisted with irritation. "Can't you keep her quiet? Some of us are trying to—" The plane lurched again, cutting him off mid-sentence as the overhead bins rattled ominously. In the momentary silence that followed, Dominic made a decision. If the situation escalated further after the turbulence passed, he would identify himself to the flight attendants and recommend moving either Pierce or the Williams family to different seats. It wasn't standard procedure for an air marshal to involve themselves in non-security customer service issues, but the potential for escalation to a genuine security concern was increasing by the minute. As the plane continued to bounce through the rough air, the cabin fell silent, except for the occasional gasp or nervous laugh. Even Pierce seemed to have temporarily forgotten his grievances as he focused on managing his evident discomfort with the turbulence. Dominic hoped the shared experience might reset the tension. Sometimes a reminder of human vulnerability was enough to bring perspective, but based on what he'd observed of Douglas Pierce so far, he wasn't counting on it. The turbulence subsided gradually, leaving the cabin in that peculiar state of collective relief that often follows shared discomfort. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, punctuated by nervous laughter and the rustle of passengers readjusting in their seats. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Folks, we've passed through the worst of that weather system. We'll keep the seatbelt sign on for another 10 minutes as a precaution, but it looks like smooth air ahead," Dominic observed, as tension visibly drained from most passengers' bodies. Shoulders lowered, grips on armrests loosened, breathing patterns normalized. But in row 8, the dynamic remained charged. Douglas Pierce had weathered the turbulence poorly. His complexion had a grayish tinge beneath the flush of alcohol, and a fine sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. Whether from fear of flying or the effects of 4 scotches on an empty stomach, he looked decidedly unwell. This vulnerability seemed to have sharpened, rather than softened, his hostility. As the plane leveled out, he turned his attention back to the Williams family with renewed focus, as if blaming them for his momentary display of weakness. Layla had recovered from her fright more quickly with the resilience typical of children. She whispered something to her mother, who nodded. "Dad," Layla called softly across the aisle to Michael. "Can I have my colored pencils from your bag? I want to finish my drawing for Grandma and Grandpa. Michael smiled, reaching under the seat in front of him for his bag. Of course, Sparrow. As he retrieved a small, zippered case of colored pencils, Pierce made another exaggerated sound of disgust. More mess, he muttered. Perfect. Michael handed the pencil case to Layla, ignoring Pierce's comment. Layla carefully unzipped it, selecting a yellow pencil with exaggerated care, hyper-aware of the man's scrutiny. In row 12, Jessica Monroe continued her documentation. She'd started recording when the juice spilled and had captured most of the subsequent interactions. Her battery was at 30%, but she was determined to maintain her vigil. Something about Pierce's escalating behavior felt dangerous to her, a sensation she'd learned to trust through years of navigating corporate environments dominated by men like him. Carmen passed through the cabin again, checking on passengers after the turbulence. When she reached row 8, she addressed Pierce first, hoping to manage the situation proactively. "How are you doing, sir? Can I get you some water?" Pierce glared at her. "You can get me another scotch. The turbulence is over and I'm still a paying customer despite your obvious prejudice." Carmen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, as I mentioned earlier—" "Save it," Pierce interrupted. "Just bring the drink or get your supervisor." Carmen hesitated, weighing the potential outcomes. Continuing to refuse might escalate the situation further, while capitulating might embolden his inappropriate behavior. It was the kind of no-win scenario flight attendants faced regularly. "I'll bring you one more, sir," she finally said. "But I do need to remind you that all passengers are required to comply with crew instructions, and excessive alcohol consumption can lead to disruptive behavior. Just get the drink Pierce demanded." As Carmen moved away, Michael caught her eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," his expression conveying empathy for her difficult position. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing down the aisle. When she passed Dominic's row, their eyes met briefly. The situation was deteriorating, and both professionals knew it. Dominic gave a subtle nod, indicating he was monitoring the situation and prepared to act if necessary. Layla had begun drawing again, her small hand carefully guiding the yellow pencil across the paper. Her concentration was absolute, her body still except for the deliberate movement of her hand, the unnatural stillness of a child trying desperately not to provoke an adult's anger. The scene stirred something deep in Dominic. It reminded him too much of Olivia's behavior in the weeks following the bullying incident. The way she had made herself small, contained invisible in spaces where she should have felt free to be herself. Carmen returned with Pierce's 5th scotch, placing it on his tray table without comment before moving on. Pierce took a large swallow, then leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes momentarily. The minutes ticked by in uneasy peace. Layla continued her drawing, occasionally switching pencils with careful movements. Tiana read her book, though Dominic noted she hadn't turned a page in several minutes, her attention clearly elsewhere. Michael maintained his vigilance across the aisle, his body positioned protectively toward his family, even while seated separately. The captain turned off the seatbelt sign with a soft chime. Most passengers remained seated, the earlier turbulence having dampened the usual rush to stretch legs or visit restrooms. Layla finished her drawing and held it up for Tiana to see. "Look, Mom, it's Grandma and Grandpa's cake with 50 candles." Tiana smiled genuinely for the first time in over an hour. "It's beautiful, honey. They're going to love it." As Layla lowered the drawing to her tray table, her yellow pencil rolled toward the aisle. Without thinking, she reached for it, her small fingers just missing as it dropped to the floor between her mother's feet and the seat in front of them. "I'll get it," Layla said, unbuckling her seatbelt now that the sign was off. "Careful, sweetie," Tiana cautioned, as Layla slipped from her seat to retrieve the pencil. In the confined space, Layla had to maneuver awkwardly, As she bent down, her head briefly entered the space by Pierce's feet as she reached for the pencil that had rolled partly under his seat. It happened in an instant. Layla's small hand accidentally brushed against Pierce's ankle as she stretched for the pencil. A touch so light it would have gone unnoticed by most. But it was the match to the powder keg. Dominic saw it unfolding, the sudden tension in Pierce's body, the shift from simmering resentment to active rage. He was already rising from his seat, moving toward row 8, even before Pierce reacted, his instincts and training propelling him forward. But he wasn't fast enough. Pierce's face contorted with an expression of such visceral disgust that several nearby passengers recoiled. His body coiled like a spring, and then Dominic heard the collective gasp before he saw the impact, the sound that would change the trajectory of Flight 1387 and everyone on it. "Don't touch me, Douglas!" Pierce roared, his hand shooting out with shocking speed and force. His palm connected with Layla's shoulder, shoving her backward with enough power to send her small body tumbling into the aisle. The impact was violent and deliberate, a grown man exerting full force against an 8-year-old child. Layla's head struck the armrest of a seat across the aisle before she landed hard on the cabin floor. For a heartbeat, the entire aircraft seemed suspended in horrified silence. Then Layla's cry pierced the air, a wail of pain, fear, and confusion that cut through every passenger's heart. Layla, Tiana screamed, lunging from her seat to gather her daughter. Michael was on his feet instantly, fury and protective rage transforming his normally composed features. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, advancing on Pierce. "You put your hands on my daughter." Pierce stood as well, his face flushed dark with alcohol and anger. "She touched me. Kept touching me after I told her not to." The cabin erupted in chaos. Passengers rose from their seats, some moving away from the confrontation, others pressing closer. Voices overlapped in shock and outrage. He pushed that little girl. "Someone get the flight attendant. Did you see that? Is she okay?" Carmen Vasquez rushed down the aisle, her training kicking in despite her own shock. "Everyone please return to your seats immediately," she commanded, then knelt beside Tiana and Layla. "She hit her head," Tiana said, her voice tight with panic as she cradled Layla, who was sobbing against her chest. A small trickle of blood ran from Layla's lip, where she'd bitten it during the fall. Michael stood protectively over his wife and daughter, his body physically blocking Pierce from approaching them further. "You're going to jail for this," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Pierce's response was immediate and venomous. "For what? Defending myself? She shouldn't have been out of her seat, touching people." He turned to the gathering crowd of passengers. "You all saw it. She came at me." A chorus of disgusted responses met this claim. She was picking up a pencil. "She's a child, for God's sake. You're out of your mind." Jessica Monroe pushed forward, her phone still recording. "I have everything on video," she announced clearly. "Everything from the moment he started harassing this family." Pierce's expression shifted rapidly from righteous indignation to something closer to concern as he registered the presence of the phone and its implications. "Put that away," he demanded. "You can't record me without consent. That's illegal. Not on a commercial flight, it isn't?" Jessica replied steadily, continuing to record. Carmen had helped Tiana lift Layla back to her seat and was examining the child's injuries. "I need to get the first aid kit," she said, her voice professional despite the emotion in her eyes. "And I need to inform the captain." As she turned to move toward the front of the aircraft, she found her path blocked by Dominic Reynolds, who had finally reached row 8. Their eyes met in brief recognition, but before Carmen could speak, Dominic addressed the entire section in a voice that cut through the chaos. "Federal Air Marshal, everyone needs to return to their seats immediately." The effect was instantaneous. The ripple of surprise moved through the cabin as passengers processed the revelation that an air marshal had been among them. Many immediately complied with his order, returning to their seats, though remaining riveted to the unfolding drama. Pierce's face drained of color. Air Marshal, he repeated the alcohol-induced bravado, faltering. Dominic turned to Pierce, his expression controlled, but his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them, and step into the aisle." Pierce hesitated, glancing around as if looking for support or escape. Finding neither, he slowly complied, raising his hands to shoulder height, and stepping into the aisle with considerably less confidence than he had displayed moments before. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though the bluster had diminished significantly. It was self-defense. The kid kept, "Be quiet." Dominic interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. "You will not speak unless I ask you a direct question. Do you understand?" Pierce nodded sullenly. Dominic turned to Carmen. "I need your cooperation as head flight attendant. Please inform the captain that we have a situation requiring law enforcement to meet the aircraft in Atlanta. Then please bring the first aid kit for the child." Carmen nodded and moved quickly toward the cockpit. Dominic turned to Michael and Tiana. "So, Ma'am, I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. I need to secure this passenger, and then I'll come back to check on your daughter. Can you please return to your seats for now?" Michael looked like he wanted to protest, but Tiana touched his arm. "Layla needs us calm," she said quietly. With evident reluctance, Michael nodded and returned to his seat, though his eyes never left Pierce. Dominic addressed the surrounding passengers next. "I need everyone to remain in their seats. If you witnessed this incident, I'll be taking statements shortly." He turned to Jessica. "Ma'am, I understand you have video evidence." Jessica nodded. "Yes, I've been recording since he first started making comments after the juice spilled." "Thank you. I'll need a copy of that recording, but please continue to secure any additional evidence. With the immediate area more controlled." Dominic turned back to Pierce. "Sir, I'm going to escort you to the rear galley, where you will remain for the duration of this flight. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're arresting me." Pierce's voice rose in disbelief. "For defending myself against, I'm securing you as a danger to other passengers after witnessing you assault a child." Dominic cut in his voice cold. "Turn around. Now." As Pierce reluctantly complied, the reality of his situation seemed to finally penetrate the fog of alcohol and entitlement. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face as Dominic secured his wrists with plastic restraints from his pocket. "This is going to ruin me," Pierce muttered more to himself than anyone else. Dominic's response was quiet but clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You did that yourself the moment you put your hands on an 8-year-old girl." As he led Pierce toward the rear of the aircraft, the cabin remained unusually silent. The only sound was Layla's diminishing sobs as her mother held her close, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay now. But everyone on Flight 1387 understood that nothing would be the same after what they had just witnessed, a moment of naked prejudice and violence that could no longer hide behind coded language or plausible deniability. The truth had been exposed at 30,000 feet, with nowhere to escape and dozens of witnesses. And one of them had it all on video. Dominic Reynolds guided Douglas Pierce firmly down the aisle toward the rear galley, maintaining a professional grip on the man's restrained arms. Passengers turned in their seats to watch their progression, some openly recording with phones, others whispering among themselves. The atmosphere had shifted from fear and chaos to a tense, anticipatory quiet. "This is completely unnecessary," Pierce insisted, his voice lowered, but still carrying an edge of indignation. "You're overreacting to a misunderstanding." Dominic didn't respond, maintaining his focus on securing the situation. As they reached the rear galley, he directed Pierce to stand facing the bulkhead wall. "Remain in this position," Dominic instructed. "Do not turn around. Do not speak unless spoken to." Flight attendant Brian Alvarez, who had been preparing the beverage cart in the galley, looked up in surprise. "What's going on?" "Federal Air Marshal Reynolds." Dominic identified himself, showing his credentials. This passenger physically assaulted a child in row 8. I need this area secured for the remainder of the flight. Brian's eyes widened. Of course. Should I inform the captain? Your colleague Carmen is already doing so, Dominic replied. I need you to stay here and monitor this passenger while I return to check on the victim and take statements. Brian nodded, his training kicking in despite his evident shock. Yes, sir. Dominic turned his attention back to Pierce. Sir, I'm going to conduct a brief pat-down for safety purposes. This is humiliating, Pierce muttered as Dominic began the standard search. Do you have any idea who I am, sir? I advised you not to speak unless spoken to. Dominic reminded him, continuing the pat-down methodically. My brother-in-law is Martin Blackwell, Deputy Director of Security Operations at the FAA. Pierce continued, lowering his voice to a near whisper. One call from him and your career is over. We can still resolve this without making it official. Dominic paused, looking Pierce directly in the eyes. Are you attempting to bribe or threaten a federal officer? The directness of the question seemed to penetrate Pierce's remaining bravado. His gaze faltered. I'm just saying this can be handled more discreetly. Sir, you physically assaulted an 8-year-old child in front of dozens of witnesses and at least one recording device. There is no discreet resolution available. Dominic's voice remained professional, but the contempt underneath was unmistakable. And for the record, I don't care if your brother-in-law is the President of the United States. That wouldn't change the facts of what happened. Having completed the pat-down and found nothing of concern, Dominic instructed Pierce to sit on the flight attendant jump seat. You will remain here until we land in Atlanta, where law enforcement will take you into custody. On what charges? Pierce demanded, his face flushing again. That will be determined by the responding officers and subsequent investigation, but at minimum assault and battery of a minor. Dominic turned to Brian. If he becomes disruptive or attempts to leave this area, alert me immediately. With Pierce secured, Dominic made his way back through the cabin toward row 8. The mood had shifted again. Passengers watched him pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect to relief. A few nodded or murmured thanks as he moved by their seats. Carmen had returned with the first aid kit and was attending to Layla, whose sobs had subsided to occasional hiccups. A small ice pack was pressed against her forehead, where a bruise was already forming, and Carmen was cleaning the small cut on her lip with an antiseptic wipe. I'm being brave, Daddy, Layla was saying to Michael, who had moved to the window seat beside her, his arm protectively around her shoulders. You're the bravest girl I know, Sparrow, Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. Dominic approached and knelt in the aisle beside them. How is she doing? He asked Carmen quietly. Minor contusions and a split lip. Carmen replied professionally, though the tension in her voice betrayed her continuing distress. No signs of concussion, but I've alerted the captain to request medical personnel meet the aircraft in Atlanta as a precaution. Dominic nodded, then addressed Layla directly, his tone gentler than anyone had heard him use before. Hello, Layla. My name is Dominic. I'm a police officer who works on airplanes. How are you feeling? Layla regarded him with wary eyes, still clutching her stuffed giraffe. My head hurts, and my lip. She paused, then added in a smaller voice, Why was that man so mad at me? The question hung in the air, its innocence and depth striking everyone within earshot. Tiana closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her features. Dominic chose his words carefully. Sometimes adults do wrong things because of wrong thoughts in their heads. But what happened was not your fault. Not at all. Layla seemed to consider this. Like when Tommy at school said mean things about Zoe's hijab, and Mrs. Peterson said Tommy had wrong thoughts that made him say wrong things. Yes, something like that. Dominic agreed, impressed by her understanding. He turned to Michael and Tiana. I need to take brief statements from both of you and any witnesses. The captain has already notified Atlanta police, who will meet the aircraft upon arrival. Michael nodded. What's going to happen to him? He'll be taken into custody and charged. Dominic replied. The severity of those charges will depend partly on your daughter's medical evaluation and your decision regarding pressing charges, which I strongly encourage you to do. Believe me, we will, Tiana said firmly. Dominic addressed Layla again. Layla, is it okay if I ask your parents some questions about what happened? You can keep resting. Layla nodded, leaning against her father's side. Officer Reynolds. Carmen interrupted. The captain would like to speak with you when possible, and we've moved some passengers to create an empty row for the Williams family if they'd prefer more space. Thank you, Dominic replied, then turned to Michael and Tiana. Would you prefer to move to an empty row? They exchanged a glance. Yes, Tiana decided. I think that would be better for Layla. As Carmen helped the family gather their belongings and move to row which had been cleared of other passengers, Dominic began speaking with witnesses. Jessica Monroe approached first, her phone in hand. I have everything she said without preamble, from the initial harassment after the juice spill to the assault. I can send you the files. That would be extremely helpful, Dominic replied, taking down her contact information. Can you tell me what you observed prior to the physical assault? Jessica's account was detailed and damning Pierce's escalating hostility. The racial undertones of his comments, his increasing intoxication, and finally, the disproportionate violence of his response to an accidental touch. Other witnesses came forward with similar accounts. Robert Daniels, the Northwestern professor, had been keeping notes on his phone of Pierce's more egregious comments. An older couple from row 9 described how Pierce had seemed fixated on the family from the moment they boarded. Carmen provided her perspective as well, including Pierce's alcohol consumption and her attempts to de-escalate the situation. Throughout these conversations, Dominic maintained his professional demeanor, but inwardly his anger grew. This wasn't just about one man's actions, it was about a pattern he had seen too many times before, both professionally and personally. The entitled assumption that certain people didn't belong in certain spaces. The escalation when that entitlement was challenged. The inevitable claim of victimhood when consequences appeared. It was the same pattern that had reduced his confident, outgoing daughter to a shadow of herself, after weeks of similar treatment at her school. The same pattern that countless others endured daily, in spaces where power and prejudice intersected. After gathering statements, Dominic made his way to the cockpit to brief Captain Robert Harding. The captain, a veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair and a grave expression, listened carefully to Dominic's account. I've already notified Atlanta Tower that we need law enforcement at the gate, Captain Harding confirmed. ETA is approximately 40 minutes. Do you consider the situation contained? Yes, Dominic assured him. The passenger is restrained and under observation in the rear galley. He's showing no signs of continued aggression. Good Harding nodded. Any recommendations for the remainder of the flight? Maintain normal operations, Dominic advised. The situation is stable, and creating further disruption would only add to the passengers' stress. Returning to the cabin, Dominic checked on the Williams family in their new location. Layla had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her mother's shoulder, the ice pack still pressed gently against her forehead. She's finally relaxed enough to sleep, Tiana said softly. Thank you for acting so quickly. Michael extended his hand, which Dominic shook firmly. Yes, thank you. I don't want to think about what might have happened if you hadn't been here. I'm just doing my job, Dominic replied, though the standard response felt inadequate. But I'm glad I was able to help. As he turned to check on Pierce once more, Michael stopped him with a question. Does this happen often? People like him. Dominic considered the question carefully. Physical assaults are relatively rare on aircraft, thankfully, but the attitudes behind them. those are far more common than most people realize. He paused, then added, "Your daughter handled herself with remarkable courage." Michael's expression tightened. She shouldn't have had to. No, Dominic agreed quietly. She shouldn't have. As Dominic made his way back through the cabin, the reality of what had occurred settled over Flight 1387 like a weight. What had begun as a routine journey had transformed into a stark revelation of the prejudice that still poisoned everyday interactions and the consequences when that prejudice erupted into violence. For the remaining passengers, the incident had shattered the illusion that such ugliness belonged to another era. It had happened here now, on an ordinary flight, on an ordinary day. And perhaps most disturbingly, it had happened to a child whose only offense was existing in a space someone else felt she didn't deserve to occupy. As the plane began its initial descent into Atlanta, Dominic couldn't help but think of Olivia and how easily she could have been in Layla's position. The thought strengthened his resolve to ensure that this incident, unlike so many others, would not be minimized, excused, or forgotten. This time, there would be accountability. In the rear galley, Douglas Pierce sat in rigid silence. The plastic restraints around his wrists, a tangible symbol of his diminished authority. The alcohol's effects were beginning to wane, replaced by the cold realization of his predicament. Flight attendant Brian Alvarez maintained a professional distance, observing Pierce without engaging. His posture was alert but not provocative, following the protocol for managing restrained passengers. Dominic returned to check on the situation, noting Pierce's changed demeanor. The belligerence had faded, replaced by a tightly controlled apprehension. "How's he been?" Dominic asked Brian quietly. "Compliant," Brian replied. "Requested water once, which I provided. No other issues." Dominic nodded his approval. "I'll take over from here. You can return to your regular duties." As Brian departed, Dominic positioned himself across from Pierce, maintaining a clear view of the restrained passenger while establishing a professional distance. Pierce broke the silence first. "I'd like to make a phone call when we land." "That will be up to the responding officers," Dominic replied evenly. "I need to contact my attorney, Pierce," insisted a note of desperation entering his voice. "This situation has been completely mishandled. That child was out of her seat during turbulence, creating a safety hazard." The seatbelt sign was off. Dominic corrected him. "And she was retrieving a dropped pencil, which multiple witnesses have confirmed." Pierce's jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter. She invaded my personal space repeatedly throughout the flight. Mr. Pierce." Dominic said, his voice deliberately calm. "I need to remind you that anything you say can be used in subsequent legal proceedings. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you exercise it." A flicker of fear crossed Pierce's face at the formal warning. He fell silent again, staring at the floor. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice lower. "Is the kid really hurt?" The question caught Dominic off guard, with its sudden acknowledgement of Layla as a person rather than an inconvenience. "She has bruising and a cut lip. Medical personnel will examine her in Atlanta." Pierce nodded slightly, something unreadable crossing his expression before his features hardened again. "Look," I reacted instinctively. Anyone would have done the same if someone kept invading their space after repeated warnings. A grown man does not instinctively strike a child with enough force to throw her into an armrest. Dominic replied, his professional tone tinged with controlled anger. And no, Mr. Pierce, most people would not have done the same. Pierce looked away, his posture still defiant but increasingly uncertain. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under." "Today of all days," Sir Dominic interrupted firmly, "your personal circumstances, whatever they may be, are irrelevant to the fact that you assaulted a child. I'm not here to understand or judge your motivations, only to respond to your actions." The cabin address system chimed, and the captain's voice filled the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Atlanta. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. We should be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. The announcement seemed to accelerate Pierce's anxiety. His breathing quickened, and he shifted uncomfortably in the jump seat. My career is over, he muttered, almost to himself. My reputation. Everything. Dominic observed the man's growing realization of consequences with clinical detachment. This moment of reckoning was familiar from his years in law enforcement, the point where the reality of accountability finally pierced the protective bubble of privilege. My brother-in-law Pierce started again, grasping at his earlier threat like a lifeline. He can. Your brother-in-law, if he's the ethical public servant I assume he is, will distance himself from your actions immediately, Dominic interrupted. Attempting to use connections to evade consequences will only compound your legal problems. The blunt assessment silenced Pierce more effectively than any reprimand. His shoulders slumped as the last vestiges of his perceived immunity crumbled. Dominic's phone vibrated with a text from Carmen Media, already waiting at Atlanta Gate. Airline PR notified about incident. Corporate crisis team activated. The speed of information travel didn't surprise Dominic. In an age of instant communication, videos like Jessica's would already be circulating through social media channels and news outlets. By the time they landed, the incident would be transitioning from private trauma to public spectacle. He typed a brief response. Keep Williams' family away from media, unless they choose otherwise. VIP escort arranged. Carmen replied immediately. Yes, customer care team standing by. Satisfied with the arrangements, Dominic returned his attention to Pierce, who had grown increasingly pale. People are recording this, aren't they? Pierce asked suddenly. It's going to be all over the internet. At least one passenger recorded the entire interaction, Dominic confirmed. And yes, it will likely receive significant attention. Pierce closed his eyes briefly. They'll crucify me without hearing my side. Your side was witnessed by an entire section of the aircraft, Dominic pointed out, including your comments leading up to the physical assault. Comments. Pierce's voice rose slightly. What comments? I didn't say anything racial, if that's what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that witnesses reported you used phrases like, you people, and made references to welfare points when speaking to or about the Williams family. Pierce's face flushed. That's not, I didn't mean those words are being twisted out of context. Dominic regarded him steadily. Context is precisely what witnesses provided, Mr. Pierce. The pattern of escalating hostility directed specifically at this family, culminating in violence against their child. The aircraft began its more pronounced descent, the change in altitude creating a momentary pressure in their ears. Pierce winced, whether from the pressure or the conversation was unclear. I want to apologize to them, he said suddenly. Before we land. I wasn't myself today. The stress, the drinking, it was a perfect storm of bad judgment. That won't be possible, Dominic replied firmly. You'll remain here until we're on the ground and law enforcement takes custody. But if I could just explain, Mr. Pierce, your opportunity to explain will come during legal proceedings. For now, your only obligation is to remain calm and compliant as we prepare for landing. The finality in Dominic's tone seemed to extinguish Pierce's last hope of managing the situation. He fell silent again, his expression cycling between anger, fear, and something that might have been regret had it appeared earlier in the confrontation. The aircraft continued its descent, the familiar sensations of approaching landing, the subtle changes in engine noise, the extension of flaps, the gentle banking as they aligned with the runway, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the tense silence of the rear galley. Dominic maintained his vigilance even as his mind processed the events of the past hour. In 15 years as an air marshal, he had intervened in numerous situations, intoxicated passengers, psychiatric episodes, even one attempted breach of the cockpit. But this incident felt different, more personal. Perhaps because of Olivia, or perhaps because the stark injustice of an adult striking a child cut through the professional detachment he'd cultivated over years of service. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." Dominic checked Pierce's restraints one final time, ensuring they were secure but not causing circulation issues. "We'll be on the ground shortly. When the aircraft reaches the gate, you will remain seated until law enforcement arrives to escort you off the plane." Pierce nodded mechanically, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated. The man who had so confidently wielded his privilege as a weapon now sat diminished, facing consequences he had likely never anticipated when he boarded the flight. As the landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud, Dominic's phone vibrated again. A message from the Atlanta field office, all arranged as requested. Officers will board first for suspect removal before general deplaning. The pieces were in place. Whatever happened next would unfold in the harsh light of public scrutiny, far from the confined space of Flight 1387. But the truth had been witnessed, recorded, and would be preserved a small measure of justice for a child whose innocence had collided with the worst of human nature at 30,000 feet. The wheels touched down on Atlanta tarmac with a squeal of rubber on concrete, the aircraft shuddering slightly before settling into its deceleration. For most of the passengers, the landing signaled the end of an extraordinarily difficult journey. For Douglas Pierce, it marked the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. As Flight 1387 taxied toward its gate, an unusual quiet pervaded the cabin. The typical sounds of arrival seatbelts unfastening, overhead bins opening, phones powering on were muted, replaced by hushed conversations and the occasional click of camera shutters as passengers documented the aftermath. In row 5, Layla had awakened from her brief sleep, her eyes puffy and confused as she oriented herself to their new seating arrangement. The bruise on her forehead had darkened a stark purple against her brown skin. "Are we there, Mom?" she asked, her voice small. Tiana smoothed her daughter's braids gently. "Yes, baby. We're in Atlanta now. Grandma and Grandpa are waiting for us." "Is the mean man gone?" Layla whispered, glancing around nervously. "He can't hurt you anymore," Michael assured her, his protective arm still around her shoulders. "The police officer is making sure of that." Carmen approached their row, kneeling in the aisle to address them at eye level. "We'll have you deplane first," she explained quietly. "There's a customer service team waiting to escort you through a private exit. Medical personnel are standing by to check Layla's injuries." "Thank you, Tiana," replied the simple words carrying the weight of her gratitude for the flight attendant's consistent support throughout the ordeal. Carmen's professional composure faltered slightly, emotion breaking through. "I'm so sorry this happened on my watch. I should have—" "You did everything right," Michael interrupted gently. "None of this is on you." Carmen nodded, composing herself quickly. "The captain asks if you'd be willing to remain on board briefly after landing to speak with the airline's customer advocacy team. Completely optional, of course." Michael and Tiana exchanged a glance. "We'll stay," Tiana decided. This can't be allowed to happen to another family. In row 12, Jessica Monroe was reviewing the footage on her phone, her expression grim. The video had captured everything: Pierce's escalating hostility, his racial innuendos, and finally the shocking violence of his assault on Layla. She had already uploaded the footage to her private cloud storage, ensuring it couldn't be deleted or lost. Robert Daniels leaned over from the adjacent seat. "That evidence is going to be crucial," he said quietly. "Are you planning to release it publicly?" Jessica hesitated. "I'm going to give it to the authorities first, and to the family if they want it. After that, I don't know. It feels exploitative to put a child's trauma online, but at the same time, people need to see what really happened." "It's a difficult ethical balance," Robert acknowledged, "but having unedited documentation prevents the narrative from being manipulated later." Throughout the cabin, similar conversations unfolded as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Some exchanged contact information, offering to provide statements if needed. Others sat in reflective silence, contemplating how an ordinary flight had transformed into a stark confrontation with prejudice and violence. The aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate. Captain Harding's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Gate B-22 in Atlanta. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have a special procedure for deplaning today." The forward cabin door opened and 3 uniformed police officers boarded, accompanied by an airline representative in a dark suit. They conferred briefly with Carmen before proceeding down the aisle toward the rear galley, where Dominic was still monitoring Pierce. A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers observed the officers' purposeful movement. Some held up phones recording this final chapter of the in-flight drama. In the rear galley, Dominic stood as the officers approached. Atlanta PD, the lead officer, identified himself, showing his badge. "We'll take custody from here." Dominic provided a brief summary of the situation, his voice low but carrying enough for nearby passengers to catch fragments: physical assault on a minor, witnesses and video evidence, compliant since restraint. The officers nodded, their expressions hardening as they received the information. 2 positioned themselves on either side of Pierce, while the 3rd read him his rights. "Douglas Pierce, you are under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the familiar words continued, Pierce kept his gaze fixed on the floor. His earlier defiance completely evaporated. When the officers helped him to his feet, his legs seemed unsteady, whether from the prolonged sitting, the fading alcohol, or the weight of his circumstances was impossible to determine. "Let's go," the lead officer directed, and the group began moving toward the front of the aircraft. As they proceeded up the aisle, passengers watched in silence. Pierce kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When they passed row 5, Michael instinctively shifted to block Layla's view, shielding her from further trauma. But Layla, with a child's unfiltered curiosity, peered around her father's protective arm. Her eyes met Pierce's for a brief moment, her innocent gaze connecting with his downcast one in a fleeting exchange that seemed to affect Pierce more profoundly than any words could have. He looked away first, his step faltering momentarily before the officers guided him forward again. After Pierce had been escorted from the aircraft, Captain Harding made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin general deplaning in a few minutes. If you witnessed today's incident and are willing to provide a statement, airline representatives will be available in the gate area. Thank you for your patience and cooperation during this difficult situation." Dominic returned to check on the Williams family one last time. "The officers will want statements from all of you when you're ready," he explained. "But your first priority should be getting Layla checked by medical personnel." "Will you be there?" Layla asked unexpectedly, her small voice carrying a trust that clearly moved Dominic. "Yes," he assured her with a gentle smile. "I'll be there to make sure everything is handled properly." As general deplaning began, passengers filed past row 5, many offering words of support to the Williams family. "Your daughter is so brave. We're all witnesses. We won't let this be swept under the rug. I'm so sorry this happened to your family." Jessica Monroe stopped briefly. "I have the whole thing recorded," she told Michael and Tiana. "I'd like to give you a copy before I share it with authorities, if that's okay." Tiana nodded gratefully. "Thank you, for recording and for speaking up." The solidarity was a small balm against the day's trauma evidence that for every Douglas Pierce there were dozens of others willing to stand against such behavior. As the last passengers deplaned, Carmen approached the Williams family again. "We're ready for you now. There's a private room prepared where Layla can be examined, and you can speak with our customer advocacy team." Michael helped Layla to her feet, keeping a supportive arm around her. "Let's go see Grandma and Grandpa Sparrow." As they moved toward the front of the now empty aircraft, Layla looked back at her seat, a small frown creasing her forehead. "What's wrong, baby?" Tiana asked. "I forgot." "Spots," Layla said, pointing to the stuffed giraffe that had fallen to the floor during the earlier commotion. Dominic, who was walking behind them, immediately retrieved the toy and handed it to her with a warm smile. "Can't leave your brave friend behind." Layla accepted the giraffe, clutching it tightly against her chest. "He helped me be brave," she said seriously. "When the mean man yelled, 'Spots told me to remember what you always say, Daddy.'" "What's that?" Sparrow Michael asked gently. "That some people's hearts are so small they can't see how big and beautiful the world really is," she recited carefully, as if quoting a familiar family mantra. The simple wisdom delivered in a child's voice seemed to echo in the empty cabin, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, the resilience and clarity of the innocent often light the way forward. As they stepped off the aircraft into the bright fluorescence of the jetway, Flight 1387 was officially complete. But the journey it had started toward accountability, justice, and perhaps even healing was just beginning. The Civil Rights Memorial Center in Atlanta hummed with anticipation as guests filed into the auditorium for the official launch of the Passenger Dignity Initiative. The space, normally dedicated to honoring the past struggles for equality today, focused on a contemporary victory that had emerged from a painful incident 6 months earlier. Layla Williams stood backstage with her parents dressed in a deep purple dress with a silver butterfly pin at the collar. At 9 years old now, her birthday had passed. The previous month she carried herself with a poise that belied her years, though she still clutched Spots, her stuffed giraffe, when she thought no one was looking. Nervous Sparrow Michael asked, gently adjusting his tie. Layla considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. A little, but the good kind of nervous, like before a school play. Tiana smiled, smoothing a stray strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, where the bruise had long since faded, leaving no physical trace of that day aboard Flight 1387. The emotional healing had progressed more gradually, but Layla's natural resilience, supported by therapy and her parents' unwavering presence, had transformed the trauma into something approaching wisdom beyond her years. "Remember," Tiana said, kneeling to eye level with her daughter, "you only have to say the part we practiced. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, just look at Dad or me, and we'll take over." Layla nodded solemnly. "I know, Mom, but I want to do it. It's important." From the other side of the curtain, they could hear Senator Maria Alvarez delivering the opening remarks 6 months ago. A child's experience aboard Flight 1387 exposed failures in how our transportation systems protect passengers from discrimination and harassment. Today we celebrate not just the legislative changes that bear her name, but the broader transformation her courage has inspired across industries and communities. The audience, a diverse gathering of legislators, airline representatives, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the case, responded with warm applause. Dominic Reynolds sat in the front row, his daughter Olivia beside him. Both wore handmade friendship bracelets that had become symbolic of the unexpected connection between two families brought together through difficult circumstances. Olivia, now 13 and thriving. After her own experiences with bullying had become Layla's long-distance pen pal, their friendship transcending age difference and geography. Carmen Vasquez was there too, no longer just a flight attendant, but now the airline's newly appointed Director of Passenger Advocacy, a position created as part of the comprehensive reforms implemented in the wake of Flight 1387. Beside her sat Jessica Monroe, whose video documentation had proved so crucial in establishing the facts of the case. Senator Alvarez continued the Layla Williams Passenger Protection Act, signed into law. Last month establishes clear standards for preventing, identifying, and addressing discriminatory harassment in commercial transportation. But perhaps more significant than the legislation itself is the cultural shift it represents. A recognition that ensuring dignity for all travelers requires more than passive non-discrimination policies. It demands active protection and intervention. The senator gestured toward the side of the stage. It is my great honor to introduce the Williams family, whose courage in the face of injustice created the catalyst for this transformation." As Michael, Tiana, and Layla stepped onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation that continued for nearly a minute. Michael approached the podium first, his expression reflecting both the gravity of the occasion and pride in how far they had come. "Thank you, Senator Alvarez, and thank you all for being here today," he began. "6 months ago, our family boarded a flight to Atlanta to celebrate my parents' wedding anniversary. We could never have imagined that journey would lead us here to this moment of collective recognition and change." Michael spoke briefly about the incident itself, then about the response that followed the immediate support from fellow passengers. Dominic's intervention and the broader community that rallied around their family's call for accountability and reform. What happened to Layla aboard Flight 1387 was painful and unnecessary. He continued, but the response to it has created something powerful and necessary, a recognition that ensuring dignity for all passengers requires more than reactive policies. It demands proactive protection. He turned to Tiana, who stepped forward to share their perspective as parents navigating the aftermath of their child's trauma while simultaneously advocating for institutional change. "We decided early on that if Layla's experience was going to become public, which it did through circumstances beyond our control, then it should serve a purpose beyond our family's individual case," she explained. The changes implemented across airlines, the congressional legislation, and the broader conversation about bystander intervention all represent meaningful progress toward that purpose. Then, with gentle encouragement from her parents, Layla approached the microphone, which had been lowered to accommodate her height. The audience grew perfectly still, collectively holding their breath as the child at the center of this national conversation prepared to speak publicly for the first time. "Hello," she began, her voice small but clear. "My name is Layla Williams. 6 months ago, something scary happened to me on an airplane. A man was mean to me because of what I look like, and he hurt me when I accidentally touched his leg while picking up my pencil." She paused, gathering her thoughts with remarkable composure for a 9-year-old addressing a national audience. "After it happened, I was afraid to fly again. I had bad dreams. I didn't understand why someone would be so angry just because I was sitting near him." Layla glanced at her parents, drawing strength from their encouraging smiles. "But then something good started happening. My mom and dad didn't just try to make me feel better. They made sure people listened to what happened. Mr. Dominic," she waved toward Dominic in the front row, who nodded in acknowledgement, "made sure the mean man couldn't hurt anyone else. And lots of grown-ups started working together to make new rules so other kids wouldn't have the same scary experience." Her voice grew slightly stronger, more confident. "Last month I flew to visit my grandparents again. I was nervous at first, but the flight attendants were extra nice. One of them told me about the new training they had because of what happened to me. That made me feel proud instead of scared." Layla reached the conclusion of her prepared remarks. "My dad always says that sometimes bad things happen, but what matters most is how people respond to them. I think everyone responded to my bad thing in a way that's helping a lot of people. And that makes me feel like what happened wasn't just sad anymore, it's also important. Thank you." The simplicity and directness of her words created a powerful moment of clarity amid months of complex policy discussions and legal proceedings. As Layla stepped back to rejoin her parents, the audience rose once again in thunderous applause, many visibly moved by her courage and wisdom. Senator Alvarez returned to the podium to introduce the formal launch of the Passenger Dignity Initiative, a multi-industry collaborative effort extending beyond airlines to buses, trains, and other forms of public transportation. The program would provide standardized training for employees, clear reporting mechanisms for passengers, and transparent accountability measures for companies. As the ceremony concluded, Layla spotted Dominic and Olivia in the audience and waved enthusiastically. The connection between the air marshal who had intervened on that fateful flight and the child whose dignity he had protected had evolved into something neither could have anticipated: a friendship between families, united by shared experience and common purpose. Later, during the reception that followed, Layla approached Dominic directly. "Mr. Dominic," she said with the directness characteristic of children, "my mum says the new rules might help thousands of kids and grown-ups that will never even meet. Is that true?" Dominic knelt to her level, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes, Layla, that's absolutely true. What started with you has already helped change things for many people and will help many more in the future." She nodded, processing this with thoughtful eyes. "That feels good to know, even though I still sometimes wish it never happened to me at all." "That's completely understandable," Dominic assured her. "The best changes often come from experiences we wish we hadn't had." As the evening drew to a close, the Williams family prepared to return home to Chicago, their role in the public launch of the initiative complete. What had begun as a traumatic encounter at 30,000 feet had transformed into a catalyst for meaningful reform, not through dramatic confrontation or political maneuvering, but through the simple insistence that dignity was not a privilege for some but a right for all. For Layla, boarding an airplane would never again be the simple act it had been before Flight 1387. But neither would it be shadowed solely by fear. It would carry with it the knowledge that her experience, painful as it was, had created ripples of change extending far beyond one flight on one day. A legacy of protection for countless children and adults who would travel the skies with greater safety and dignity because she and her family had refused to remain silent. And in that knowledge, she found not just healing, but purpose, a gift perhaps more valuable than the innocence that had been too early compromised. As the lights dim on the celebration at the Civil Rights Memorial Center, we pull back to view the scene from a broader perspective. Not just the specific individuals whose lives intersected aboard Flight 1387, but the larger tapestry their story has woven across American society. What began as a moment of shocking violence against a child has transformed into a movement for dignity and protection that continues to gain momentum 6 months later. The Layla Williams Passenger Protection Act represents more than legislative change. It stands as a powerful reminder that even our most vulnerable citizens deserve protection from discrimination and harassment in public spaces. This story challenges each of us to consider: what would you do if you witnessed injustice unfolding before you? Would you remain silent, reasoning that it wasn't your problem to solve? Would you document without intervening, believing evidence alone was your responsibility? Or would you find the courage to stand up, to speak out, to insist that dignity is non-negotiable for every person regardless of age, race, or circumstance? Dominic Reynolds chose to step forward when it mattered most. Jessica Monroe chose to document truth that might otherwise have been denied. Carmen Vasquez chose to advocate for change within her industry rather than accepting inadequate protocols. And the Williams family chose to transform personal trauma into public good, ensuring their daughter's experience served a purpose beyond their individual case. If this story has moved you, we invite you to join our community of viewers committed to standing against discrimination in all its forms. Subscribe to Unheard Truth Stories, where we spotlight voices too often ignored and the actions that create meaningful change. Share your own experiences in the comments below and help us build a world where stories like Layla's become increasingly rare because we've collectively decided that such treatment is simply unacceptable in a just society. Remember, creating change doesn't always require grand gestures or public platforms. Sometimes it begins with a single voice saying, "This is wrong," when others remain silent. Sometimes it's the courage to document truth when others look away. Sometimes it's the willingness to stand beside those who are vulnerable when they need protection most. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If it resonated with you, please hit the like button and share it with others who need to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine light on injustice and celebrate the courage of those who stand against it. Your support helps us continue bringing these important narratives to a wider audience. Has something similar ever happened to you or someone you know? How did you respond? Share your experiences in the comments below. Every voice adds to this important conversation, and together we can create meaningful change one story at a time.